Welcome to today's webinar, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Grace Nicolette. I'm the Vice President of Programming External Relations here at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And I'm excited today to welcome you to our webinar on our recent research release, Staying Connected, How 5 Foundations Understand Those They Seek to Help. In case you haven't read it yet, it's available for free download on CP's website, cp.org. The topic of listening to and hearing from beneficiaries and having their voices inform foundation grant making has been a vital discussion in our sector. And today we hope to bring some fresh voices and inspiration for doing more of this kind of listening. But before I get too far, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items for our time today. First, you'll notice that we're in a webinar format, which means all of you are muted upon entering this session. We've also turned all of the attendees' videos to off as the default. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we hope you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. And I'll be curating the questions, and we'll have a Q&A time at the end, and we'll try to be as responsive as we can to as many questions as we can. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send a link to all of the registrants in a follow-up email after this webinar is finished. And we'll also be sharing with you links to resources that are talked about during this time, as well as a brief survey that we hope you'll take the time to fill out, as it really helps us to improve our programming work. So with that out of the way, back to today's webinar. Many of you are familiar with CP already, but in case this is your first time hearing about us, we are a national nonprofit serving foundations and other major funders. Our mission is to provide data and create insight so philanthropic funders can better define, assess, and approve their effectiveness, and as a result, their intended impact. Today, we wanted to bring to life a recent report we released called Staying Connected, as I mentioned. And this report was made possible by funding from the Fund for Shared Insight, a funder collaborative working to improve philanthropy from the inside out and informed by insights from the people that you serve. Shared Insight emerged from the belief that funders are the most effective and can do the most good in the world if you're more open. That includes opening to sharing with each other what you learn, opening to listening to and acting on input from grantees and the people that you seek to help. So I'm really excited today that Melinda Tuan, the Fund for Shared Insight's Managing Director, will be introducing our panel and also moderating our discussion today. So Melinda, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace, and welcome to everybody who is on this webinar today. It's a privilege to be here with you and my esteemed panelists. It's very exciting for me to introduce to you Jennifer Glickman, who is the Manager of Research at CEP. She'll be giving us an overview on the research findings. And then I'll be moderating a discussion with our panel of discussants, including Tony Richardson, who's a program officer with the Nord Family Foundation, and he's going to be calling in from Phoenix, where it's nice and warm. And Victor Leandry, who's the Executive Director of Centro, calling in from Ohio. Edna Ortiz, who is calling in also from Ohio, and she is a resident and participant in some of the services that El Centro provides. And along with Edna is Suzette Sanchez, and she is a caseworker who's working at El Centro, and she'll be providing language translation for us, as Edna's primary language is Spanish, and so we'll be asking questions in English. She'll be responding, and Suzette will be helping with the translation. So many thanks to Suzette for joining us in that capacity. And at this point, I would like to hand over the conversation to my colleague, Jennifer Glickman, to talk about the findings from this report.
Thanks, Melinda. So I'm going to start by just briefly giving some background on CEP's research on and interest in this topic of understanding beneficiary need. So in research we conducted in 2016, we found that nearly 70% of foundation CEOs believe that learning from the experiences of those they are ultimately seeking to help holds great promise for increasing foundation impact in the coming decades. Yet, over the years, we've also seen many indications that this learning doesn't always tend to occur, particularly in the eyes of grantees. As an example, in 2014, CEP found that nonprofit leaders believe that most of their foundation funders lack a deep understanding of the intended beneficiaries, and they see this lack of understanding reflected in foundations' funding priorities and programmatic strategies. So all of this led us to ask, What are foundations that are rated highly by their grantees on their understanding of beneficiary needs doing to develop that knowledge? And how can foundations get better at learning about those needs? So as Grace mentioned, with the support of the Fund for Shared Insight, we wanted to dive into these questions by profiling foundations that are exemplars in this area. And to identify exemplars, we looked at grantee ratings in CEP's Grantee Perception Report, or GPR as we like to call it, which is a survey instrument that foundations commission to receive confidential feedback from grantees on a range of issues, such as a grantee's experience with how fairly they're being treated by a foundation, their comfort in approaching a foundation when problems arise, and their perceptions of a foundation's impact on their organization, field, or communities. So for this particular research project, we determined foundation eligibility to be profiled by looking at the foundations that ranked in the top 15% according to grantees' ratings on the GPR on the questions: how well does the foundation understand your intended beneficiaries' needs? And to what extent do the foundation's funding priorities reflect a deep understanding of your intended beneficiaries' needs? These two questions were added to the GPR in early 2016, so we were only looking at foundations that commissioned to GPR between 2016 and 2017. The 5 foundations we ultimately interviewed for our profiles, and we were seeking to get diversity in terms of foundation type, size, location, and focus area, were the Nord Family Foundation, who we'll be hearing from today, Helios Education Foundation, the Duke Endowment, the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, and SC Ministry Foundation. We conducted interviews over the phone with the CEO and a program staff member from each of these foundations, and each interview lasted about an hour. We also asked foundations to provide us with the contact information for 3 to 5 grantee organizations that the foundation believed could speak to its understanding of their intended beneficiaries and also the impact that understanding has on the grantees' work. We then invited CEOs of those grantee organizations and interviewed them for their perspectives as well. Through our interviews with the 5 highly rated foundations and the grantees they work with, we recognize some common practices. So all 5 foundations who are seen by their grantees as having a deep understanding of beneficiary needs listen to and learn from grantees as the experts doing the direct work on the ground, recognize the importance of going out into the fields and communities that their work supports, and hire staff from the fields in which they are funding. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Melinda so we can dive into a discussion of these practices and many more.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen. I appreciate that overview and the excellent research that CEP conducted. As Jen mentioned, today we're going to be featuring a conversation with the Nord Family Foundation. And at this point, I'd like to ask all my panelists to unmute themselves so that they can be heard on the webinar. I'm going to start first with Tony, and it looks like you're still muted. Excellent, thank you. The Nord Foundation was identified by CEP's research as a funder that understands the people they seek to help. What does the Nord Family Foundation do to foster this understanding of the beneficiaries of the nonprofits that you fund?
Well, I think it really starts from kind of capturing the spirit in which, Evan and Eric Nord, kind of imbued into the kind of their business, right? Their corporation, the Nordson Corporation, where it was all about listening to directors, working with employees, engaging customers, being on the shop floors, and really listening and taking that learning to inform their products, right, and service delivery. And our foundation and the family and our staff really captures that importance of learning and allowing that learning to influence our work. So we approach the work in a sense that we don't have all the answers, and until you engage the people that are in the space doing the work, responding on the ground, you truly can't have a sense of what's actually going on. And so it's about trust. It's about transparency, obviously learning, and then, just appreciating and understanding the ecosystem in which our grant making functions, right? So not just the organizations that we work with, but their partners, their beneficiaries, and so that we can truly serve in a way that is effective as opposed to what we think is effective, right?
Great, thank you, Tony. And I may follow up with asking for more specific examples of how you do some of those things. I'm going to turn to Victor now. Victor, I want to make sure you're unmuted. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with the Nord Family Foundation and how they support your understanding of the people you seek to serve?
Definitely, definitely. I've been the director of our Centro for 13 years right now. And as soon as I came to this role, I understood that coming from a poor community and a very isolated community, very poor, very small, I understood that I needed to rely on foundations and local foundations. And from the way that I operate, I knew I needed to develop a relationship with the foundations. I didn't want to be one of those organizations that would go every year asking for money without having a true relationship. So, but for me, it was easy because Nord Family Foundation, that's their culture. So it was very easy for me to be myself with the foundation that's the culture that they practice. So we have developed a relationship that is based on trust. We really value each other's work, and we rely on each other in the services that we provide to the community. So for the 14 years, I have never seen myself as a grantee. I always see myself as a partner. When I receive money from the foundation, I don't feel like they're giving me something. I feel like they're investing in me, and for that, it makes the partnership very strong. But I have a very open relationship with them. They always pick up the phone when I call. I feel so welcome to this foundation that I can call in between grants. I can call and say, this is new in our community, this is happening, this is my goal, this is what I experience. But they do the same thing. Sometimes they call me and ask me, Victor, this is a new trend, this is what we're hearing, what could you do for the Latino community? So it goes both ways, but they always listen, and most important, they are also a foundation that welcome initiative and creativity. So they're always willing to hear, what do you have in your mind, your new project, or what do you think it needs to happen in the community? So I have a very good relationship with the foundation.
And Melinda, I'm going to circle back to that point that Victor just made about, partnerships. And, we really are mindful and intentional about not creating hierarchies and really looking at each other as partners. You find when you create hierarchies, there are inherent power dynamics. And I think sometimes that can skew a funder's perspective on its role in the community. It could also create hubris, lead to some, arrogance there, and also can be misleading in terms of our effectiveness, right? So I really am big on kind of just like language and the power in language, and how, if you're going to work with a partner, then there needs to be a bilateral two-way street where learning and listening takes place on both ends.
And Melinda, this is Victor again, and I'm sorry, but I feel the same way with everybody in the foundation. I can pick up the phone and call John Mulaney, that is the executive director, the CEO, but I can pick up the phone and call Tony or Don, that are the officers, and talk to them. So depending on the need or what is the issue, I can go to any of them, and the treatment is exactly the same, and the outcome is exactly the same. So it's a culture that the foundation have.
Mm-hmm. And Tony, I have a follow-up question for you about this. We don't have other of your grantees or partners on this webinar, just El Centro. So do you feel like there's a similar relationship you have with other nonprofits in your community as well, where they can also call you at any moment and have a direct line to you?
Absolutely. So to Victor's point, more of a cultural thing than it is a case by case. Even with organizations that may not be partners or may be coming for an initial pilot, or, so we really see ourselves as kind of like these artisans of humanity, right? And we are in this space, again, leveraging our resource, which just isn't always a grant, right? So it's what other resource tools we bring to the table, whether it's experience, whether it's leveraging other foundations and learning from other communities, peer-to-peer exchanges. and really, really, again, working to create capacity, be creative in helping organizations, whether they're, long-term friends or maybe new to the space, right? So we feel as though everyone has something to offer. And along those lines, if you don't, if the relationship doesn't culminate in a grant, I think there are other ways to partner and to be kind of on the same page in terms of doing good work in communities.
And how, back to you, Tony, another follow-up question, and then we're going to turn to questions for Edna, so get ready, Edna. But Tony, how many grantee partners do you work with at a time?
So it really fluctuates. So we do grant making, obviously, in Lorain County, which is, in Ohio, sits on the mouth of Lake Erie, and our neighboring county to the east, which is Cuyahoga County, which is where Cleveland sits. And then we're in Metro Denver, Greater Boston, Columbia, South Carolina, and upstate New York. So like the Finger Lakes region. Mm-hmm. And given time, I could be working with 40 to 65 different organizations. And again, in terms of, with half of our grant making staying in Lorain County and with our anchor being in Lorain County, I'd find those sometimes relationships are a little more, I don't know what word to use, but just kind of longer standing. And so we're in each other's backyards, right? Yeah. But we still resources to those other communities as well. And because we're not on the ground in those other communities, we've really taken on this role of the convener. And just, identifying issues in communities, looking at systems audits, getting an understanding of ecosystems, and then bringing the various players, nonprofits, funders, government, business to the table to attack certain issues in those respective communities.
Great. I anticipate some of the people on the webinar will have follow-up questions for the question and answer period. But I'd like to turn now to Edna, and thank you for unmuting. I'm going to start with an earlier question just about how have you been involved with El Centro to date? What kind of services have you used with them? How have you interacted with them?
Quiero preguntarte cómo estabas involucrado en el centro, qué tipos de servicios has utilizado de ellos.
Bueno, desde que llegué, personal para interpretarme, el servicio de las clases para las personas diabéticas, padres comprometidos.
I have done, and I have used the interpretation services. I have taken the different classes for diabetes and chronic conditions, and I have done the class that is for, it's called Padres Comprometidos. It's an engagement class for parents in the school system.
Great. And I also heard that you have been providing feedback to some of these programs and services in the community.
También ha dado tu opinión y sugerencias para estos programas en la comunidad.
Sí, he podido dar mis sugerencias, expresarme como ciudadana.
I have been able to give them my opinions and my suggestions and express myself as a member of the community.
So I'm curious, Edna, when you give feedback, how do you know that you've been heard?
Cuando das tus opiniones a tus sugerencias, ¿cómo sabes que te escucharon?
Bueno, porque lo veo en las diferentes situaciones que he estado como ciudadana, cuando necesito una interpretación. Sí que veo que ha mejorado la situación en cuestión a la interpretación. En otros servicios que a veces pues he tenido que buscar.
I can see it when I have been using the different services. There's a lot of things that have been now are better interpretation services and other things that we have asked for and they have been able to provide.
Now let me, Melinda, can I add, this is Victor.
Yes.
Victor, Edna, could you talk in regards to the Padres Comprometidos class, in regards to when the class allowed you to meet with the principal and the superintendent, and for you as a parent give suggestions in regards to the school system and suggest improvement, and then how do you guys are also thought to follow up and come back to them and let them know if those are being met or not and follow up. But part of that curriculum is through Unidos US, and that's the goal of the program, to teach parents how to have a voice in the school system. And she has been one of those, I know, because I've been there when we bring the superintendent and the teachers, that the parents talk about their concerns for their Latino kids, and then we bring them back in a few weeks for them to talk about if those issues have been solved or not. But Edna, could you talk about that?
Que si puedes hablar un poco de las situaciones que se nos van a ver comprometidas, como cuando hemos traído al principal de la escuela y tú pudiste expresarle tus sugerencias o tus preocupaciones, y de qué forma cuando unas semanas después se han vuelto a reunir, has notado que has podido resolver las situaciones y que la situación mejoró.
Sí, claramente sí, porque pudimos exponer nuestras ideas, nuestras preocupaciones como padres que tenemos estudiantes en la escuela, en el sentido de por ejemplo, yo que tengo una niña de educación especial, en la situación de ella en la enseñanza.
I was able to provide suggestions and feedback, and since I have a special education child, my concerns were heard and they were taken into account.
En cuestión también tengo una sobrina que ya está en la high school y a veces uno tiene situaciones de, por ejemplo, la seguridad y las situaciones, pero creo que todo se ha ido resolviendo a la medida que hemos necesitado.
I have another needs that goes to the high school, and there was some security concerns in the high school, but they have been
and just to add on to that, I want to situate this discussion around this broader context of the school district we're talking about is Lorain City School District. It's one of 2 districts in the entire state that has been taken over by the state and have academic distress commissions after 3 straight years of all Fs on the state report card. And you have 40% of the students identify as Latino or Hispanic. And so, and about 35% is African American, but traditionally, those particular demographics didn't necessarily have access in a way that is, as intentional and meaningful as it is. And I think with Victor being at Centro and being a true leader of that community, and not just the Latino community, because I think what's happening in Lorain City is that El Centro is really, over the last 5-7 years, have become a social service provider for a lot of people, like just the poor, right? The poor and working poor of the community, not just the Latino community. And so having someone like Victor that's on the ground, that has those connections, that appreciates and truly understands the needs of the community, and then can take those needs and then, marry it with what's going on in the schools, so that those relationships and that feedback and that input is very meaningful and provides a platform for us to move the district forward.
Great, thank you for that context. And there's a whole case study that could be written about that whole feedback loop process between the foundation, working with the ecosystem, schools, and El Centro's role, and Edna's role as one of the people that's speaking up and providing feedback. So I have another question for Edna, and Victor actually put me up to this. Do you have any feedback for El Centro and their services specifically?
Mi opinión personal para el centro es que son un personal muy competente que saben lo que saben, competente con lo que hacen y los servicios que ofrecen.
I can say for myself that all the personnel is really competent, and they really know the services they offer.
And how do you know that your feedback to El Centro is being heard? Have you ever asked them to improve anything? And how do you know that you're being heard by them?
¿Cómo sabes que te escuchan? ¿En algún momento le has dado alguna sugerencia y has visto?
Bueno, siempre que he llegado al centro, he visto la cordialidad y siempre me han escuchado. ellos ofrecen tantos servicios, ayudan tanto a la comunidad, que la única sugerencia yo creo que yo tendría para ellos sería a lo mejor que tuvieran un poco más de personal por situaciones de que ellos a veces tienen que salir a interpretar y a lo mejor necesitan a alguien que se quede en el centro, pero relacionado a todo lo demás, creo que el centro es una magnífica organización.
They have always, every time I go to the Centro, they have always, treated me kindly and cordially. I will maybe can say that they could have more personnel so they can offer more services to the community.
Mhm.
We all wanted that.
Well, thank you, Edna. I'll
That's
come back
Edna.
to Edna in a little bit, but my next question is for Victor. So you're connected with the community, and I would just like to hear more about how do you listen to the people you serve in Lorain County? How do you make sure that they know that you've heard them?
Yeah, it is about being connected. It is about collaboration. I don't have a lot of staff in my agency. We're a small nonprofit. We have like 21 staff. We use a lot of volunteers, and a lot of people, even my peers ask me, how could you do it? I make time to be connected, whether it's about health issues, opioid epidemic, education, seniors, at the end of the day, everything relates to everything. So I need to keep in top of what's happening in the community. So I partner a lot with all other nonprofit organizations. I travel a lot in regards to knowing what's happening with the Latino community at a state level and at a national level. So I always try to connect dots and being a partner. It's not about just our center, it's about the community. And it takes a lot of my time, but I think I have to do it. I have to be connected with other nonprofits and other services and what's happening in the community in order to better serve my community. I have to.
And can I add on to that? I think it's important that, when we talk about our nonprofit partners and we think about the leadership, in that partnership, and Victor does a great job of having a very diverse staff too, right? And I think it's also important that, you highlight and we talk about the fact that, there's a lot of different subcultures and kind of interculture connectivity and relations that happen. And someone like Victor has to be very dynamic to go into this community of, groups that are living on the periphery, seeking access, being a partner in African-American community, being a partner at the schools, and then going to different foundations and understanding that culture and that language as well. So, I mean, it's a very, very tough job. And I think you do it gracefully because you're passionate and you really care. And those are things that don't necessarily show up on a resume. Those are things that you just kind of feel, right?
Yeah, thank you. And Melinda, also, we have done in the last maybe 10 years, I have done a capital campaign, a strategic planning, a feasibility study for CDC. But in all of those occasions, we always interview the community. I am one of those directors that even though my budget is very small, and we are always in need of money for our services and our budget, when I do a strategic plan or when I do a feasibility study, I don't play around with interviewing the community. That has to be part of it. We have to have the money there, and the money usually come from, in those occasions that I have mentioned, have come from North Family Foundation. I have been able to go to them saying like, hey, I have a strategic plan. I don't want to do a strategic plan like any other nonprofit. I really want to have a consultant that can help me move forward this organization. And they've been very grateful of supporting my strategic plan and paying for that person coming and doing it. But part of that is because I don't want to do, like usually nonprofits go into strategic plan and they bring some board members and some staff and they decide what they're gonna do. I want to interview my foundations. I want to interview my customers, my clients, the leadership. So that's part of how I run our Centro. I have to hear the voice of the community and incorporate that in all the services that we're doing.
Yeah. So Victor, it sounds like for these important pieces like capital campaign, strategic plan, make sure to hear from the community. I'm curious, do you try to listen or survey the community or the people you serve on a systematic, ongoing basis in any way?
We do. It's depending on the program. Some programs, like for example, the interpretation program that we do for Mercy, every month we put out surveys, not only for the clients, but for the doctors and counselors that are receiving the interpretation services too. We do it for the senior program. So some programs have more than other ones, but we do get the feedback from the clients. And we always, for example, the interpretation services, being one of the biggest services right now. We do it for all the mental health agencies and Mercy, that is one of our local hospitals, one of the biggest ones. And we get that feedback from the client and also the providers. And we always check in at their feedback and how could we improve it and incorporate it in the training that the interpreters receive every year, those feedbacks. So we're on top of that.
Great, thank you.
We have to.
Yeah. So Tony, my next question is for you. We talked when we did a preparatory call for this webinar about the importance of authentic listening and acting on what you hear. And I'm curious, what advice do you have for other foundations that are listening to this webinar and who are interested in better understanding the people and communities they seek to support? What would you suggest they do?
So I have maybe 3 points that I would, lay out. So I think number one is obviously you want to elicit feedback through various mediums, right? So obviously it's the anecdotal, oral feedback from your partners. I think it's important to look at, systems level work, get a sense of what's happening in the ecosystem and what's going on in the community and how it's all interconnected and, what's the best approach to, solve issues, right? And not necessarily look at it as a grant season to season type deal, but more of a, how do we invest long term to think about alleviating some of the societal issues that may be affecting a respective community. So I think needs assessments, systems audits are important. And also think, having independent, third party evaluators. So for example, and this isn't a plug for CEP, but we really leveraged the Grantee Perception Report. And I think it's a very probative tool and it allows you to get honest and authentic feedback in a way that doesn't that won't make your partner think that it could affect their funding, right? So they give it to you honestly on those things, right? But then once you get that feedback, number two, what you want to do is, whether it's good or bad, right? Once you glean that feedback, you want to allow it to inform your grant making strategies and practices moving forward. It's important to chronicle those learned lessons, not just for you, your staff, and your board, but for the philanthropic community, for nonprofit partners. You want to share those lessons. And lastly, I think the partnerships, again, have to be bilateral in a sense that, accessibility is important, trustworthiness, and kind of just this lack of hierarchical perspective in terms of your role as a funder. Because again, I think sometimes those hierarchies can really skew, just our perception of what's happening in communities. It allows like hubris to kind of seep in, and it can really lead to funders being tone deaf. And last but not least, this idea of you really want to, go away from this transactional grant making and looking at, grants go in, checks go out, and really look at, how do you leverage resources in a way? So, peer-to-peer exchanges, research, consultants, supporting non-traditional grant making, being flexible, nimble, and not being afraid to take risk, right? I think philanthropy is where we can take our risks. And the only time we fail is when we didn't learn from the mistake that we made, right? So those would be the takeaways I would give.
Great. And I'm going to ask Victor the same question and then ask Edna the same question. So we get that perspective from the funder, nonprofit, and then someone who's participated in the program. So Victor, what advice do you have for the foundations that are listening about how they can support their nonprofit partners to listen to the communities they serve?
I have to go back to something that I mentioned before. It's about giving that individual that is representing a nonprofit the capability to express themselves and feeling comfortable with the foundations. I know every year I put in a grant to these foundations, but every year, even before I write that grant, I call to the officers and I invite them to our Centro to have that conversation in regards to what's happening in my foundation, what could you support, how could you help me here before I even write the grants? Because it's about that conversation that need to happen. They're very good at every year, and I know there's many of my foundations listening to this conference call, but every year I do what I call, and my board know that I call it a foundation tour. So every March or April, I invite all my local foundations to come to our Centro and talk about what's happening in our Centro and in my community. I don't do it in regards to trying to get more money, or it's my responsibility to inform the foundations of what's happening in my community. And so far, for 4 or 5 years, the turnout in those meetings has been fantastic. And North Miami Foundation usually help me organize this kind of meeting and invite other foundations on my behalf. But it's having that honest conversation in that place where nonprofit directors can feel value and can feel like, okay, we're partners here, and we can have an honest conversation in regards to what's happening in my community. And I know you're investing on me, so I feel part of this team.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to turn to Edna, who can unmute herself. So Edna, what advice do you have for foundations who are listening about how they can better understand the people and communities they seek to support?
¿Qué consejo le daría a las fundaciones que están buscando para mejorar las comunidades a las que les sirven?
Yo entiendo que comunicarse con las organizaciones sin fines de lucro, que brinden servicios a la comunidad, que los escuchen, que escuchen sus necesidades, que tiene la comunidad para poder emplear los recursos y que hagan la diferencia.
Communicate with the organizations that serve those communities, to listen to them, to be able to assess their needs so they can bring their efforts and meet those needs, get a plan going to meet those needs.
Mm-hmm. Great. The thing that's been very striking to me across our conversation is Fund for Shared Insight. We're a funder collaborative that's looking to help foundations and nonprofits meaningfully connect with each other and with the people and communities they seek to support, to listen and to act on what we hear, in order that people and communities would be better off in ways they define for themselves. And what's really striking to me from our conversation today is that for Edna to feel comfortable giving feedback to El Centro and to the schools and the hospital, there needs to be trust. And for Victor to be able to
foundations, we have to invest in that, right? I mean, there's nothing more important than being on the ground, hand in hand, and partnering in a way that's meaningful and intentional, and showing our partners that, hey, again, there is no power dynamic. We want to learn, we want to know, and then we want to incorporate that into our grant making. So to all the funders out there, support the site visits, continue to get your staff out in communities, and get out of the office. We can't do too much sitting behind our computers.
Yeah, so very specific next step would be actually to budget for travel for your staff.
Absolutely.
And make the time for it.
And Melinda, if I can add to that, and it's also from the other side, as a director, I really appreciate and value when foundations and program officers show up to any events that I'm having at our Centro. So I'm usually inviting them to events, and I feel so happy every time they come, not during their site visit, when they come, when I have events that I didn't plan it for the foundation, I planned it for the community. So when they show up and they can be part of that celebration with the community and the clients and everything else, you get my staff and my board and even myself this kind of feeling that it's like, this is the partnership. They're right now here in the midst of whatever celebration we're having or meeting or whatever it is. They're here, same present. And this is what I see from North Family Foundation.
Great, thank you. And Edna, we're going to allow you to be the last one to officially address the webinar participants before we go to questions from the field here. Is there any last advice you have for the people listening?
Bueno, yo realmente cuando llegué aquí donde primero recibí una ayuda, un servicio, fue en el centro.
When the first I arrived, the first place I received help and services was at el Centro.
Yo creo que si el centro no existiera, estuvieran la comunidad latina y no latina, estuviéramos un poco perdidos, porque realmente los servicios que se ofrecen ahí ayudan realmente a la comunidad y a las personas.
If el Centro wouldn't exist, the Hispanic and non-Hispanic community will be lost. The services they provide there really help the community.
Great. And it sounds like they're doing a really good job of listening.
Okay.
So at this point, we're going to open it up for questions, and I'm going to let Grace moderate in terms of asking the questions, and then I will direct the questions to the various panelists.
Yeah, so if you guys have questions on the call, please feel free to use the Q&A box. We've had a number of really good questions already, so in the time remaining, we want to make sure we can get to as many as we can. So Melinda, several questions on a similar theme. So I think we've talked about the foundation meeting with El Centro kind of having the foundation tours, and then El Centro being in the community and really sort of representing that community voice. There have been a few questions around, concretely, if we were to land with some takeaways on how a foundation can hear directly from beneficiaries, what would be some best practices around that? And actually, how would the foundation use that information?
Great. Why don't we have Tony? Can you take a cut at answering that question? How do you directly hear from the people in the communities? And are there any tips, tools that you would suggest for other foundations to do the same?
Absolutely. So, we have an interesting kind of situation because, I'm a former at-large councilman, won 2 elections. And then, prior to coming to the foundation, I'd resigned and then was recently named the chair of the Academic Distress Commission by the state of Ohio. And so, I'm on the ground. I live in the community. And, I also, again, I as Victor said, I'm out, I listen, we're engaged, and not just me in our office, all of us are out, and, we put a lot of time in to really be around people to learn. But in terms of just like some concrete takeaways, I'm a big fan of town hall meetings. So when you look at your respective grant making area, whether it's arts and culture, whether it's health and social services, civic affairs, town hall discussions where you allow funders and our nonprofit partners and their partners to be a part of those town halls. Surveys are important. Being a part of collaboratives and where funder collaboratives or collaboratives that are seated by your partners, and then getting feedback from those collaboratives, and then sitting on boards, sitting on regional associations, just being in as many places as possible where you can learn, right? So I don't think there is a one kind of size fits all, but you need to be on the ground. You need to be a part of regional, statewide, regional, national associations. You need to obviously read local newspapers, regional, national newspapers, convene town hall meetings, convene partners in your respective grant making areas. And I think, anything that falls in between there is like, hey, it's off your radar, right? So those are some concrete things that I think are important.
I think part of this being the second half of the question is, how do you synthesize all of that? You're sort of out in the community, and how does it get digested in a more systematic way for the foundation, or is it sort of part of the ecosystem of your knowledge more broadly?
Yeah, so I think in terms of like the quantitative side of it is we see a lot of it in kind of community needs assessments, or we'll see it in systems audits, or it'll kind of culminate in a grant from a particular organization. But I think so you will have those different data sets around kind of U.S. Census and kind of what the schools report, what the state reports, with our health and social service agencies report out. But I think it's also important that some of the kind of non-quantitative, some of the anecdotal stories, when you hear about families, 200 families living in a motel on a lake that's, the motels are dilapidated, or when you hear about, only 2.3% of students are graduating or entering their senior years in high school ACT remediation free, right? So it's being and listening to those things, and then going to those different players that are in that field and just, and not going in with the answers, just going into, you know, how can we assist as opposed to this is how we want to assist. So again, you have the non-quantitative, the quantitative, and you synthesize it based upon what the partners in that particular space, you know, how they synthesize and how they think it can be most useful.
Now, if I can add to that, but I see the value also every time Tony or Don or John call me and say, hey, have you worked with this organization? They're doing similar work, or Victor, you can enhance these other services that this other organization is providing. And it's connecting those dots that sometimes we're so busy and we have so much in our plate that we don't see it. But the foundation had that opportunity because they're always talking with grantees and knowing, and they're in the community and they see it. So I value from North Miami Foundation every time they connect me with other organizations, whether it's for me to help them or for them to help me. But those connections are very important for me.
That's great, thank you. A couple other questions for Tony along the theme of, so I think it's very evocative. You mentioned, Victor, that you pick up the phone and call Tony anytime and vice versa. With the number of grantees that you have and the different areas that you all work nationally, how do you prioritize this work of listening to beneficiaries? And do you have any advice on how foundations can prioritize this work better, given you have a lot on your plate? You know, what does that prioritization look like?
So again, it's about kind of honesty and transparency and just being truthful about workflow, right? So we have 3 grant cycles, and you know, if you're looking to apply in April, you know, and it's kind of, you know, we're approaching March, I'm going to probably give you a little more attention than if you're looking to come back in August or October. And then also, I think it's important because we are in these different communities and there's so many different partners. What's easier for me is just to pick up the phone and call me, right? So if you're a partner and you're looking to, you know, you have an idea or you want to propose something to the North family, and you write like a 4-page email, that's going to be hard to turn around because we have so many other partners and things going on. So for me, my cell phone is like, hey, give me a call. I give everyone my cell phone and let's talk through this, give them some pointers orally. And then, you know, let's synthesize this and kind of can like make it concise. And then we can talk about, you know, what a proposal will look like, right? So it's being honest about your workflow, being responsive. I try to respond to emails within 48 hours, phone calls within 24 hours. And again, you know, you manage your workflow based upon like the greatest need at that particular time. So it's more of just like, it's like this FIFO, like first in, first out kind of deal, right? And if there's anything that I can do within like 2 minutes of time, quick email, quick call, I'll just do it so that way it's not on my plate and my plate doesn't build up. So it's about just being efficient.
Great, thank you. The next question is, this is a very interesting one. Does the term beneficiary really capture the reciprocal nature of the relationship between foundation staff and their community partners described today? Beneficiary doesn't seem to capture the two-way nature of that relationship. Is there another term we could use in philanthropy to capture that dynamism?
Yeah. Ooh.
I had to think about that one.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start, and then I'd love to hear from Victor and from Edna too, what they think about this. Fund for Shared Insight, our work is about elevating the voices of people whose voices are least heard. And we have frankly struggled with, to use beneficiary, there's constituent, there's the people we seek to help, to serve, to support, to, you know, how do we describe the customer at the end of our work, the people whose voices we want to elevate. And we would love to hear from Victor, from Edna. You know, are there any good words that we can use to describe?
You know, I have to be very honest. Every time I see the word grantee, beneficiary, it doesn't relate to me, but I know my feelings is that I have a partnership. So for me, that's what is important. You know, I understand that it's part of the vocabulary and the language that we talk in between nonprofit and foundation. So when I see it in writing, I understand it. But the important part is that I feel it's a partnership. So whether I read that it's a grantee or beneficiary, I feel partner. So that's how I feel it. But you're absolutely right. The word grantee for me or beneficiary doesn't quite capture.
Mhm.
Yeah, so just to add into that point, I particularly use the word nonprofit partner when describing, Victor's organization, El Centro, and to the people that they serve, I'll say partners. Um, I think the language is so important because we all are partners. And I mean, even, words like, I've heard a lot of different things, like clients really rub me the wrong way. But I look at these people. I look at us all as partners. And again, I don't see a hierarchy, right? Because I think in order for foundations to function, we need that kind of like ecosystem and that kind of like revolving kind of partnership. So I see it all as a partnership.
Yeah. So I'd be curious to hear from Edna if you have an opinion on, like, you have participated in El Centro services, you've given feedback. Like, is there a words that are better to use?
¿Qué quieras usar?
Sí, yo describiría, es como la lealtad, el compromiso que tiene el centro para ayudar a las personas.
I will call it a compromise. The compromise that el centro has to serve the people.
Pero si ya yo soy una persona que ya recibí mi primera ayuda y ya me dirigieron el camino, ya yo así puedo ayudar a otras personas.
If I already went there and I already received some help, I already I'm finding my way, and then I can help more people.
Great.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question. And I think this one is one for Tony. And it's, in listening to local communities, how do you determine the level of risk you'll take on in grant making, particularly if the proposed work is new and there's no track record to gauge the potential risk and reward? So I think the question is coming from, as you're listening to folks, opportunities may come up that may be a little less proven, and how do you approach that?
Absolutely. So, immediately first, we always look to other communities that we do grant making to see if there's something similar. So, for example, I just met a woman in Cleveland who wants to start a food rescue program where she essentially will go around to different, restaurants or, major league sporting facilities, catering companies, and take their food that it hasn't been used or touched and turn it around to nonprofits. And so we support a group in Boston called We Don't Waste, as well as a group, Denver's We Don't Waste, Boston is Loving Spoonfuls. And so I immediately said, well, how about we do a peer-to-peer exchange? We'll send you to Denver. Called Arlen Preblood, the CEO at, our executive director at We Don't Waste. He said, I'd love to bring her out. In fact, she can come to our open house. And I said, would you be willing to give her just kind of a full overview of your operations from the time you wake up to the stops, to pickups, to drop-offs? And so for us, it's, are there other people around the country, not just in our grant-making communities, that we could learn from? But then two, then how do we kind of, how do we balance that risk and sort of manage it in a way that doesn't allow our foundation to take on as much risk as possible? So we'll try to bring other funders to the table, right? Our local or regional funders, and say, hey, this is what's going on. Do you have an appetite? And try to have a sense of, because we know what a lot of the different foundations fund or what they support. And so we have that information and we'll leverage it and try to send them in that direction and get additional support. And if we think that it's something that it's needed, and we think that the leader of the organization, they have a strong board, strong kind of staff, then we'll be first in. And Nord Family has had a track record in that. And I think that's something that our executive director has really tried to, just embed into the culture, is that we take risk, right? And again, it's kind of being risk tolerant as opposed to risk averse, right? If you look at this country, it's through risk and through innovation that we've become one of the strongest countries in the history of civilization. So we try to have that same spirit in our grant.
Great, thank you. So with that, we've come to the end of our time. I wanted to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. Really rich conversation. I wish we could keep going on. There's those who are on the line, I know there are more questions we were not able to get to. We will actually be sending out, again, that email link with the video. And ways to get in touch if you'd like to learn more. So thank you so much again to everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.